Personality. Basic questions we're going to be addressing in this lecture. What is personality? How is personality measured? How can behaviorism be applied to the understanding of personality? What is the social cognitive perspective on personality? So we'll start with this rather large question. What is personality? Well, we all have one, but what is it? And I want to go back to when we we're in chapter 1 and I had you follow a set of instructions, and probably most of you did that. That is, you've ended up with a paper airplane, and then we attempted to explain how is it that I'm able to predict with such a great degree of accuracy that people will comply and go along with my my request. And we came up with sort of a superficial but important explanation. That is, if we're trying to explain behavior, any behavior, no matter how simple or complex, usually it's a end product of a very complex interaction between disposition and situation. So disposition is kind of what you bring to a situation, that is traits and attributes and moods and so forth, that in some cases don't vary a whole lot across time and across places. The situation really is just that. It's the power of the environment, power of the situation, to influence how we think, feel, and behave. So in this section, we're going to be looking at the disposition term in this equation. That is, if we're trying to explain behavior, part of it really has to do with us, and that's really the domain of the personality psychologist. Whereas in the next section, we're going to be looking at the power of the situation, which is really the domain of the social psychologist. So this equation really reflects, if we're trying to explain behavior, really it reflects this important intersection of personality and social psychology, which are two big subdisciplines within the broader discipline of psychology. So let's begin with a working definition of personality. Think of it as an individual's, that's you and me, unique and relatively stable patterns of behavior. So that's how we're going to define personality. There's historically been different ways people have attempted to tap in and measure different personality traits and attributes. So physiognomy, which was the examination of facial features, it was thought at one time that a person's features, physical features of their face, you could tell something about their inner personality traits and attributes by just sorting out what kind of eyes they have or what kind of nose, so we could make a determination about an internal state or trait or attribute based on somebody's appearance. There was also the phrenologists, Franz Gall and company, who believed that they could discern traits and attributes, internal characteristics from external features. That is, the lumps and bumps and indentations on a person's skull would be able to would correlate with internal traits and attributes. Actually, no scientific evidence for either of these approaches. Modern strategies include projective tests and objective, or otherwise known as self-report, personality inventories. So we're going to look at these different types of measures, and really what personality psychologists are interested in part is identifying personality traits and attributes of interest, describing them, measuring them, and then correlating them with other important events and outcomes in life. Like, how does this thing called self-esteem, which we all have a certain amount of at the trait level, how does that correlate with other important stuff in life, like how well we do in school, how well we do in social situations, and that sort of thing. So it's important to try to describe and identify and measure and then work with traits and attributes. And often these traits and attributes can be of the pathological type, personality disorders and so forth. So we're going to be looking at modern strategies to measure personality. And then we'll get into theories of personality a little bit, explaining where personality comes from. All right, so take a look at this image. And If you want, you could pause this video and sort of jot down what it is that you think you're looking at. So if you could do that, that would be great. All right, so presuming you're back and you've sort of hatched a notion of what you think this is, well, this is one of the images that you would see if you were taking the Rorschach test. The Rorschach test is a test that's been around for quite some time, and it's known as a projective test because what people notice and what they sort of the story that they hatch about what it is that they see is thought to be somehow reflective of their inner life. So what typically people see is a fox or a wolf. Those are typical responses, and then you have people that see things that most people don't see. And the idea is that once you've run the person through the Rorschach test and you analyze their responses, and actually the analysis of people's responses is very complicated. It's quantitative. You could take an entire class on the Rorschach. Many clinicians do if they plan to use it. And what the outcome of the analysis of the respondents' responses are is it captures some personality traits and so forth that the person wouldn't have been able to reveal if they were asked directly. So in other words, it's hard sometimes for us to articulate deeply held emotions and thoughts and beliefs about ourselves and the world, but rather we need to kind of get at that indirectly. So this is kind of the idea behind projective tests, that people will project onto some ambiguous stimulus that which reveals something about their inner life that would be very difficult for them to sort of articulate directly. So the Rorschach is the most widely used projective psychological test, based on the principle that subjects viewing neutral, ambiguous stimuli will project their own personalities onto them, thereby revealing a variety of unconscious conflicts and motivations. So often this is used in clinical settings to assess personality structure, identify emotional problems and mental disorders. So it's a very commonly used projective test. The other one I wanted to touch on is the thematic apperception test, or the TAT. So it's similar to the Rorschach in that the test consists of a collection of cards, and we'll look at one in a minute. But the cards have images on them, and again, it's used to evaluate a person's patterns of thoughts, attitudes, and so forth. So it's a projective test in that you're not asking a person directly, who are you, and what are your deeply thought, possibly unconscious motives, and that sort of thing, but rather to get at that stuff indirectly. So the procedure involves a test administrator showing a test taker a series of cards, and then there's specific questions that are asked about each one of those cards. So let's take a look at one of the cards in the thematic apperception test. So the questions would be, what is the event shown in the picture? And then the test taker would sort of hatch a story about what they think is going on there. And there's infinite possibilities. And then what has led up to the event? What are the characters in the picture thinking and feeling? And then what's the outcome of the event? So in the end, what you end up with is a narrative that touches on each one of these questions. And then an analysis of that narrative is revelatory about some aspect of the person's inner life. And again, one person could see in this picture, maybe it's an academic setting where the person holding the pipette is a rising star in her field, and maybe the person that's watching her is a jealous PhD advisor who resents the brilliance of her student and is going to do everything in her power to get in her way. There's one possible story. Another story would be it's just the opposite of that. Maybe you have a brilliant student who has a brilliant PhD advisor who is all about helping her students become all that she is capable of becoming, making a mark in her field. So whatever you see in that, it becomes the data to be analyzed, and then that analysis will reveal something about the person's motivations and aspirations and that sort of thing that they might not have been able to reveal sort of if they were directly asked. So again, this is a projective test that gets at personality indirectly. All right, so let's talk about the objective of the self-report inventories. These are quite a different sort of test. So you might have completed one of these at some point. They're often used in employment settings and personnel selection. They're used often in clinical settings and that sort of thing to tap specific personality traits. So in the objective self-report inventory is the subject, that is, the test taker must provide answers to a number of objective questions. So these are often large batteries of questions that are either true, false, or some of them are multiple choice. Yes, no. The scoring is something that involves norming, that is, the tests are administered in some cases to thousands and thousands of people, so you get an idea of sort of what a typical range of score is on the measures. And then a person's individual score is sort of located in a distribution of other scores, so you can see if the person is scoring around what a typical person would score, or maybe they're above or below what a typical person scores. So that's how you get a sense of where somebody's at by comparing their score against the norm. All right, so here's an example of a personality measure that measures an individual trait. So if you could please pause this and go through each of these 10 items and then indicate 1, 2, 3, or 4 to the extent that you disagree or agree with that item. So pause this and please complete that. All right, so presumably you have a number, a value attached to each one of these statements. So I'm going to show you how to score this. So you're going to have to rescore items 3, 4, 5, 7, and 9. And what I mean by that is, for example, look at what you have for item 3. So presumably you have a 1, a 2, a 3, or 4 for item 3. What I want you to do is take whatever score that you've put initially for that item and then just change it to the one that I have below it. So if you put initially a 1 for item 3, get rid of it and give yourself a 4, and then move on to item 4. I certainly feel useless at times. If you put a 4 for that, get rid of it and give yourself a 1. Whoops. So do that for items 3, 4, 5, 7, and 9, and then you're going to end up with 10 values. And then you sum across those values, and that will be your score for the test. And what this test is measuring, or what this scale is measuring, is the construct of self-esteem. So you could think of self-esteem as the attitude that you have towards yourself. The highest you could score on this scale is 40, the lowest is 10. So most people will score somewhere around the middle, which I think is somewhere around 28. It's been tested for reliability, validity. It's a very commonly used self-esteem measure. So self-esteem is one of these traits that we assume that most people, or all people, actually have some modicum of. It's that evaluative dimension of yourself. So many studies have taken people's individual self-esteem scores and then correlated them with other important stuff. So high self-esteem is correlated with increased subjective well-being. That's SWB. So people that are scoring higher on this scale seem to be more satisfied with life. They're more productive. They're more confident. They have a greater sense of personal control. That is, they feel like they have control over the things that they find reinforcing in life. Whereas low scores correlate with expectations of failure, pessimism, lower sense of personal control. So the higher you score on this self-esteem measure, the more of that stuff called self-esteem that you have seems to be correlated with other positive stuff. This scale that you just completed it's the Rosenberg scale. It measures global self-esteem. That is, it's an overall self-esteem that we carry with with us across time and across places. It's pretty stable across administrations. There's also other little or smaller domain-specific self-esteems that are variable. So, for example, you might have a self-esteem for yourself as a student. You might have a self-esteem for yourself as a social animal. You might have a self-esteem for yourself as an athlete or a musician or something like that. So there's all kinds of domain-specific self-esteems that can also be measured. So this is an example of an objective measure. We get a score, and then that score can be correlated with other important stuff. Another very commonly used objective self-report inventory is the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. And this is the most widely used self-report personality test. I think there's some 300 items on the full battery, but it could be broken out into 10 subscales. So you don't have to administer the whole test. If you want to just use a part of it, you can. The scoring, you can expect to score somewhere around 50 plus or minus 10 on each of the subscales. So 50 you would consider to be kind of right down the middle where most people score, and then if you're scoring within plus or minus 10 of 50, so between 40 and 60, you would be considered to be falling within the normal range. And then if you fall outside of that 40 to 60 range, then you're either high or low, extraordinarily high or low on that particular scale. The MMPI is primarily used in clinical settings to tap those personality characteristics of the pathological type, or may be linked to some sort of psychological issue, depression and paranoia and so forth, sociopathic tendencies. It's used in forensic settings as well as clinical settings. So, for example, if a defendant has been accused of pedophilia, right, which is a crime, wanting to have sex with minors is, it's considered a disease. It's in the big book that's used to diagnose psych disorders, so it's considered a pathology. So if somebody is being accused of sexual misconduct, as part of their defense, they might want to go to a forensic psychologist or psychiatrist, or somebody who's trained in the administration of psychological tests and have their tendency to engage in this kind of behavior measured. So, and this could either help them or hurt them if it's shown that they are the type of person that might be inclined to want to have sex with minors. That would not be helpful to them, but it might show that they're not that kind of person. So the MMPI is pretty widely used. So I'm just providing this slide to show you examples of those 10 clinical subscales. I don't expect you to know these, but there's a collection of them that tap these different personality traits. So we've got hypochondriasis, depression, hysteria, psychopathic deviant, masculinity, femininity, which is that where we kind of fall on gender identity, paranoia, psychasthenia, which is maps onto what we now call obsessive compulsive or OCD disorder, schizophrenia, hypomania, and social introversion. So this MMPI has these 10 scales that tap all these different particular attributes. So here's an example of 3 people who've taken the MMPI, and we could see their score. So let's just look at Jane. So Jane, we see here, is high on hypochondriasis, depression, hysteria, psychopathic deviant, low on masculinity and femininity. So let's see her scores on, hypochondriasis at 70. So depression, it's up here above 70. So on these traits, she's scoring outside of the range that we would consider to be sort of the normal range. Whereas Pete, he's kind of scoring within 40 to 60, so he's only scoring sort of higher than we would expect on masculinity and femininity. So that means that he's positioned himself score-wise on this scale where he's identifying more than what you would expect people to identify with the masculine role. So that's kind of what you'd get and how you'd interpret the values. You'd locate a person's score on these scales within a range. So let's do a concept check here. The Rorschach is a blank kind of test. The MMPI is a blank kind of test. So Rorschach is a projective test, and the MMPI is an objective or self-report inventory. The blank is a test that consists of a set of cards that portray human figures in a variety of settings and situations. That would be the thematic apperception test, or the TAT. Here's another one. If you needed a personality inventory capable of measuring a person's degree of psychopathology, you would probably use A, B, C, or D. Well, you'd probably use the MMPI. All right, so a quick evaluation here of these tests. So the pros, users or these proponents argue that they can yield valuable information about personality. They certainly can. Certainly there's aspects of ourself that would be difficult to articulate if we were asked directly. So these tests and measures can tap into those traits and attributes, and then also scores on them can be correlated with other important stuff. They certainly have their utility. The cons, for example, the projective test, the Rorschach, in particular, has been criticized for being very subjective, both on behalf of the test taker and the test administrator. Really anybody can say anything they want in response to any of those ink blots. So we really don't know if somebody's honestly responding. We don't know how a test administrator is perceiving or interpreting the test results. Even though the scoring method is very complicated and quantitative, there is a substantial amount of subjectivity that falls on the test taker and also the test administrator. A weak support for validity. So measures are supposed to pass two tests, that is the test of validity and the test of reliability. So validity has to do with if a test is supposed to measure something, some personality trait or attribute, or some specific aspect of your inner life, then there should be some way to assess whether it measures what it's supposed to measure. So tests that have been conducted on the validity of the Rorschach test are really mixed. So does the Rorschach really measure these specific traits and attributes? There is some question about that. Certainly, if somebody takes the Rorschach and their results are scored, it certainly can begin a conversation about a person's inner life that maybe would have been difficult to begin without having some sort of way to get at that stuff. Self-report tests like the MMPI all suffer from socially desirable responding. So this is a response bias on behalf of the test taker. That is, some of the questions might, if responded to honestly, might lead the test taker to see themselves in a not so positive of light, and we want to skew our responses so that whoever's reading our responses or making sense of our responses is going to see us positively. So we either consciously or unconsciously might skew our responses so that we maintain a positive image of ourselves, and that others will see us in a positive light. So this is a kind of a pervasive problem in these sort of self-response or self-report kind of tests. Some tests have checks on this. So the MMPI, for example, has a lying scale. So you're able to see if the person is responding in a way that's consistent across the different items, and there's actually a way you can see whether there's internal consistency to the responses. And if a person is all over the place with respect to their responses to items that should kind of be close together, correlate together, then you know the person is kind of fudging their responses. All right, so we've talked a little bit about measuring personality. The big question really is, whence personality? Where does it come from? Why are you the way you are? It's kind of an important question to ask and try to get answers to. So we're going to look at, in this lecture, the behavioral perspectives, so Skinner's views, and also Albert Bandura's social cognitive view, and then we'll look at Freudian and the humanistic perspectives in the next lecture. So let's start with Skinner. It's pretty basic. So Skinner viewed personalities coming from the outside, that it's determined by the experience of having our, consequences of our actions, rewards and punishments, and so forth. So really, there's no internal, mysterious, unconscious, or even biological basis of personality, but rather we've learned to be who we are. So how does the Skinnerian or an operant conditioning inherent explain personality? Well, we are the way we are because we've acquired these response tendencies through conditioning. So I want to show you an example of how this might work. So you have a person who has the trait of being the social extrovert. They're the life of the party. How do they become like that? Well, you land that person in a particular context, say a party. They tell a few jokes. In response, they get laughter, attention, and compliments. So that's the positive reinforcement. So what do you suppose happens to the probability of them acting like that the next time they find themselves in that environment? Well, they're going to tell another joke because they're going to get reinforced for that. So this is kind of a simplistic way to look at personality, but it kind of makes sense that as a behaviorist, you view a person coming into the world a blank slate. That is, the experiences that they have in the world with reinforcement and punishment kind of shapes their these response tendencies. So you land a person in a particular environment, they're going to behave in it. They're going to learn to behave in a particular way, and that's how a behaviorist views personality. So it kind of makes sense if you consider your own personality. You've got many traits and attributes. So identify one that you possess, that you think you have, and then consider how you might have acquired that through the processes of operant conditioning. So you're a motivated organism. You've operated in different environments over the course of your development. What rewards and punishments have you experienced that might have shaped you into the kind of person that you are today? So you have a behavioral repertoire that's pretty reliable and consistent across time and across places. How might you have you acquired that response tendency or tendencies through conditioning? All right, so the pros and cons of the behavioral perspective. Well, the pros based on extensive empirical research. So Skinner spent a lot of time in the lab with rats and pigeons, identifying what he thought were fundamental laws of behavior. And this provided many insights into the effect of environmental factors. So behavior can be shaped through rewards and punishments. And Skinner had no problem generalizing what he was finding in the lab with rats and pigeons to the human case. Say somebody likes to gamble, and they go to Foxwoods and casinos and so forth, and we consider that to be part of who they are. Well, Skinner would say, well, we don't need to explain the person's gambling behavior in terms of some internal dispositional trait or attribute, but rather that behavior has been shaped through their experience of rewards and punishments. Cons: overdependence on animal research. So if you want to find out about people, probably you should do some of the studies that you're doing with people. And behaviorists do most of their research with rats and pigeons. And then lastly, this fragmented view of personality. Is personality really simply response tendencies acquired through conditioning? Or is there more to personality, social learning, a view of a person as an active, thinking, feeling individual with a self-concept, beliefs about themselves that and perceptions of others, or beliefs that they have of what others view them? Does anything else? Our genetics, our biological predispositions? Is there any other things that we need to bring in to bear upon the question, whence personality? And the answer is yeah. So fragmented view simply means that from a behaviorist standpoint, everybody's personality has been shaped through their individual experience of rewards and punishments in their particular environments that they've populated through the course of their development. So there's no real common basis, other common bases that we could say that people share, but rather personality really is a very personal, individual thing that's based on somebody's own personal experience in their environment. All right, so we'll finish up here with the social cognitive model, and this is Albert Bandura. We've seen before in the section on learning. So Bandura certainly believed that people acquired their response tendencies or their personalities through classical and operant conditioning, but also viewed that people were also active interpreters of their environment and that we're inclined to seek reward and sort of avoid punishment. We want to maximize, we want to act in such a way to maximize our favorable outcomes. So what Bandura emphasized in his work was cognitive influence behavior. So certainly we respond to rewards and punishments, but there's more to us than that. We're not passive respondents of environmental inputs, but rather we're active, thinking, feeling individuals. And so Bandura's social cognitive model really emphasized observational learning. That is, we learn from models. We watch other people get rewarded and punishment for doing what they do. And then, at least in part, we incorporate that person's repertoire into our own. So we watch other significant others, and then we become like them. And Bandura conducted this famous Bobo doll study, which we visited in Chapter 6 on learning, where children were exposed to an aggressive and a non-aggressive model, then they were allowed to free play. And it was viewed that, or it was found that the kids who had viewed the aggressive model acted much more aggressively than kids who had seen the non-aggressive model. So importantly, when these kids were evaluated 8 months later, 40% of the same kids reproduced the violent behavior observed in the initial Bobo doll experiment. What this suggests is that a single exposure to aggressive model had an influence on their action. So if we as individuals think about ourselves as parents or possibly future parents, if a single act can lead to or is associated with a child incorporating our actions into their own, this is a rather profound finding. It means that we really have to be careful in what we're doing and how we're modeling our behaviors with our children, because they're watching us all the time, and it could be that they're going to incorporate some of our behaviors into their own. So the incredible power of parents have over their kids is to shape and to eventually affect the outcomes for our kids, because they will become, at least in part, like us. So it's something to consider from time to time, how the significant others in our lives have shaped our personality. So are you like your mom or your dad? Are you like your brother or sister or anyone else that you've maybe admired, a significant other in your life? If you incorporated their repertoire into your own. So this can serve as a partial explanation of the question, whence personality? We've acquired certain response tendencies through the principles of operant conditioning, and we've also become who we are by watching and observing significant others, incorporating their repertoires into our own. So take a look at the learning objectives. There's a red font objective. Make sure you get into the reading about the biological and trait approaches.